Hello and welcome to another episode of Great Women in Compliance with Hemma Lomax and Lisa Fine, produced by the Compliance Podcast Network and sponsored by Corporate Compliance Insight. Our guest today is Amy Wilson, former White House Presidential Innovation Fellow, founder of the Culture Shift Studio, guiding council member of Either.org, and author of the book Empathy for Change. If, like me, you are passionate about creating vibrant, resilient, human-centered organizations with lovable cultures, you are in exactly the right place today. Amy, thank you for agreeing to join us today and welcome to Great Women in Compliance.
Yes, I'm happy to be here and have this conversation with you.
Well, we're going to have a lot of fun today. So look, I always ask my guests before we dive in if they can share a little about their background and maybe ask you specifically what led you to focus on organizational design and the culture evolution.
Yeah, so first off, I'm not going to tell you my whole life story, right? Because we don't have all the time for that. But I want to share some early influences that I have with my work. My work has always centered on how organizations evolve, not just structurally, but culturally. So I've worked across government, like social impact, nonprofit spaces, but also in the corporate environments as well. And it's given me this broad perspective on what makes change stick at the end of the day. So I also recognize from an early age that I have a systems thinking approach. So systems being, seeing the whole bit, the 10,000 foot level of what is contributing to my engagement versus somebody else's engagement in this whole system that we're in, the ecosystem. So I've hit on different things in my career: human-centered design, participatory decision-making, behavioral psychology is some things that I put in. But I've been the director of innovation for probably about almost 20 years now in all those different sectors. So I'm able to see these see the intersection of culture building and compliance at the same time.
Well, this is why I wanted to have you as our guest, because there's so many things you've just mentioned that are near and dear to my heart, but they really just seem like buzzwords sometimes. It's how do we actually put them into action? So I know that's what you're going to help us with. Now, you created something called the Culture Shift Studio, and you joined something called the Guiding Council of Either.org. Can you tell us what inspired you to join that and create the studio?
Yeah, so first off, I noticed seeing a disconnect in the world that as I went deeper into this work, obviously you learn, it's I've been acting like a Picasso, if you will, for most of my career. I've been learning, how do you do organizational change? How do you do innovation the way an MBA student might or a consultant might? But then I noticed deep down inside there's this disconnect that was happening as I saw this recurring problem that organizations are focused on policies, on strategies, and top-down mandates that come, but they're really failing to engage the people that's actually living in the systems in an appropriate way. And so many organizations see compliance and culture as two separate things, but they're very connected. What I see in a strong compliance program is not just about mitigating risks. It's about creating a workplace where people feel safe and accountable, but also included in the process. So first off, I have been on this journey with the Culture Shift Studio, and calling it by different names as I go forward, but it's still the same idea, that what we're trying to do is to go deeper into organizations and feel like I'm not designing an organization for people, but with people, right? That's the heart of what I have been building my career about, building movements and not mandates. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But I'm bridging the silos that happen. So Either.org works at the intersection of organizational design, culture, and equity. So it's actually a nonprofit organization that helps people navigate this complexity and uncertainty of our work today. I'm on the guiding council of it, essentially the board of it. And what we do, we're doing research on how do you genetically resequence organizations, essentially, to change our hearts and minds into a place where we can actually think in a way where where we talk about what could a liberatory workplace look like, right? And so the Culture Shift Studio was this response to this deeper issue that people aren't being equipped to navigate emotional intelligence and psychological safety at work. And those two things are at the heart of what innovation is. There's a missing ingredient that I've seen here is that compliance and culture programs often lack emotional connection and participation from employees. So I wanted to help organizations create change through engagement rather than enforcement.
Music to my ears. This is brilliant and exactly what we need in the compliance world. I can speak from personal experience that we're all after that, and now we just need to operationalize our best intentions. Now, look, I know your work applies in many spheres. I mean, it applies obviously in the corporate world. One would say there is culture everywhere. It could apply in schools and churches, but you've also worked for the US federal government, I think, as a presidential innovation fellow at the White House. So I'd love to ask you a bit about how your work there impacted your decision to dig deeper on organizational design, culture, and compassion.
Yes. So think about it, working at the highest levels of government I worked in the Obama administration and then continued into the first Trump administration. So that's that unto itself, working in the White House amidst two different, very different worlds allowed me to see really what's shaping the world today. And this Presidential Innovation Fellows program was a program that was created by Obama to bring in outside expertise into government to rethink and reimagine government from a human-centered lens, right? We're called the entrepreneurs in residence for the White House. And so being in that program, especially in the role that I was doing, leading innovation.gov, by creating a whole movement of change called the Better Government Movement, gave me this bird's eye view of government and bureaucracy. I worked on some of the nation's biggest organizational challenges. We did about 600 pages of research on what does innovation and change mean in the public sector. And it's also gave me insight into how these institutions balance rules, leadership, and change at the same time. And I also saw firsthand that policies don't transform organizations. It's the people that really does the transformation itself. And so we might have well-intentioned policies, but they often fell flat because there isn't a cultural movement to support them, So I saw that especially in the White House, there's an executive order that comes down. It's kind of this parent-child relationship that happened in government. It's being like, I'm telling you what to do. And then people are in fear almost, and by a forcing function, they have to do something. That's not a way to get change done, right? And it creates fear and anxiety for people. How might we actually take the people who are actually taking these policies, who work with policies every day, and collaborate with the policy makers to actually understand how do we make a better policy at the end of the day, right? And also in the government, compliance is really critical. So but so is trust at the end of the day. And I think that's a missing element in this work, as we all often say, move at the speed of trust, not at the speed of necessarily compliance. And I see how psychological safety and buy-in are essential to this ethical decision making. That I think when I think of compliance, I think of like, how do you imbue a sense of ethics in everyone, right? To follow the ethical bounds upon which we are living in. So, yeah.
I'm excited for our listeners. Now, you mentioned the phrase movements, not just mandates. And so we're going to dig deep in that a little bit, but can you give us a quick teaser of what that means?
So, yeah, back when I was working as a presidential innovation fellow, I came across this article that was in the Harvard Business Review that said, changing company culture requires a movement, not a mandate. And it really stopped me in my tracks because it's exactly what I was already seeing in the world. This is probably like circa 2016, 2017. And often though, how change happens often is that somebody who is in a position of power tells another person or tells the company, we're going to change, right? So that's like over and over and over how change has been done, right? In many different ways. But then if you look outside of federal government spaces or just like outside of work, you see movements of change. You see the civil rights movement. There's this phrase that Margaret Mead says that never underestimate, I'm paraphrasing here, but there's thoughtful, committed citizens can make a change. It's the only thing that ever has made a change happen. So I started seeing this, particularly in the change when in the first Trump administration, there was this zeitgeist. In the zeitgeist was like, we need to build a movement of what we care about. So at the end of the day, like the idea of mandates don't you really work. Like I was saying, that executive order telling you to do something is kind of a stick. We're going to tell you to do something rather than the carrot, leading somebody to do that. But what is happening often, and this is an interesting statistic, is that new policies, new training, new compliance programs might come out, amongst other things, but 70% of any change effort is failing in the world. And that is a number from McKinsey, who actually created the change management platform back in 1982. 40 some years ago was when they were creating this. And so what what is I think the main thing, and they say this in the article, is that they don't say this in so many words, but they say that culture isn't changed through this top down enforcement. It's built through collective action amongst everybody. So movements engage people, mandates instruct them to do things. And so a mandate tells employees what they must do, while a movement makes them want to be part of the change. And so a lot of my writing, a lot of like my book, a lot of other things talk about how do we move people to evolve themselves, and not just involving individual people in there, but how can we evolve the organization to come out of the industrial age, which many companies are still stuck in, into a more egalitarian like world that we're living in today. So
Lovely. No, that's exactly what we need. That's exactly what we need. And look, I read that article. It's an HBR article by Brian Walker and Sarah Saul that you shared with me. I'll definitely share it with our listeners. And I want to go into the magic of movements and the magic of change through movements with you. Before we do that, we're not talking about change for change's sake here, right? There's actually a problem we're trying to solve in the workplace. I asked, why aren't we thriving? And you talk a lot about the workplace culture crisis. I think you've highlighted in your writing a striking number, for me at least. 81,396 hours, you said, was the average time we spend working in a lifetime. So just that, the fact that I'm spending 2/3 of my day, if not more. But many people aren't thriving at work. Amy, what's causing this disconnect? Why are we not thriving at work?
yeah, well, that number is 1/3 of our waking lives. That's at work, right? So think of that. And also, some people in my community has also taught me about we've inherited, right? We've inherited a lot of things from our overarching culture, from where we came from, but we also inherit a lot of our thinking and the way we should do things from work. So essentially, work is a big part of how we function, right? Everything we've learned at work. And also, if something happens in work, it also affects us deeply too, right? So let me give you some more statistics, right? So 77% of people in workplaces are either disengaged or miserable at work. That's a staggering number. Three quarters of people, more than three quarters of people, and then half of people are actively in burnout. And there's more stats coming out day by day that says that we're burnout, we're disengaged, we're miserable at work. So a third of our time is really stuck in a place where we don't feel like we can get out of, right? But what I really think about is I think that workplaces can be an ecosystem for human potential.
Yeah.
And so if we spend that much time at work, it should be a place where we can grow and contribute and feel valued, because if we're spending a third of our time there, that's like this lovely vision of like, well, we could do better, right? And we must, because we're burnout, we're in a place where we're disengaged and miserable. And it's not just a place where we check a box, where we endure stress and the burnout that happens. And there's a disconnect because, living in a capitalistic society as we do, I think late stage capitalism is some words that people thrown around. Organizations often are prioritizing efficiency, compliance, and short-term metrics, but they're neglecting the idea of trust, of psychological safety, meaningful engagement, and the emotional well-being of their people. And that's where we look at the long-term success. Over time, there's lots of statistics that says that we actually, if we do focus on those things I talk about, you actually can be able to have better communication, better working relationships, and higher performance and higher retention at the same time. So, yeah.
And all of that, I'm assuming, translates into profit at some point, right? If you've got a thriving workforce, that
Mhm.
is, I love the framing you said, this ecosystem of pursuit of potential, human potential, that only then, 10x is your ability to make money from human potential. So yeah, utter common sense, utter common sense. But some companies are stuck in survival mode rather than fostering a thriving culture. So what's happening there? What are the key warning signs we should look out for to see that we're getting stuck in survival versus thriving?
So I want to tell you, like, why aren't people thriving to begin with? And then we can go in deeper into like the challenges organizations are facing, I think. So there's a disconnect, that disconnects going deeper into that. So first off, culture is thought of as an afterthought. It's not the foundation of what we should be doing. And there's, yeah, like I said, prioritization of profit, of performance, of risk mitigation while neglecting that human experience of what we're doing every day. Our workplace culture often becomes transactional and not relational, right? So work is a series of tasks that you need to do. And then you get out, right? And then live the other 2/3 of my life. I would say, if we look at the other 2/3 of our, existence, a third of it's probably spent sleeping. So a third of it is with our friends and family and doing the things we love, right? And so people start feeling, if it's transactional and not relational in the workplace, people start feeling like a cog in a machine rather than an actual contributor to the work. Engagement is plummeting, and we see that in the stats. Psychological safety is missing. Research shows that employees are less likely to speak up, take risks, share new ideas if they don't feel safe to do so. That's the heart of psychological safety. There's also burnout culture is normalized, right? So we glorify overwork, constant availability, no boundaries in our workplace, and that leads to disengagement and chronic stress and attrition at the end of the day. And then the last thing I'm thinking about too is that there's mandates without meaning at the end of the day. And what I mean by that is companies implement compliance programs, maybe diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, and wellness policies, but they feel very performative and disconnected from the daily reality. And this goes back to burnout. So they're not going to have lasting impact because if your people are burnt out, right, and they're stressed out, there's this thing called empathic distress where if the whole system is in distress and giving distress signals, our nervous systems pick up this network of distress. So we're distressed. And so at the end of the day, if you're if you're in a place of distress, if you're in the fight and flight that comes with being in burnout, if you're now told I need to comply with this thing and it's going to make my life even worse, off than it is, it's just like you don't have the capacity to do that. So that's one thing that's happened in the workplace. Yeah.
Well, I think we can all see that again. Back to the impact, the even broader impact that has, as if burnout and humans not thriving was not a bad enough impact. It also has an impact on the people that they serve, right? Because
Mhm,
if there's a priority on customer experience, but
mhm,
your employees are having the worst experience ever, it's very hard for them to translate their experience and turn switch on and give a good customer experience. I also think there's a lack of agency. You said about this command and control style leadership, where you're just
mhm,
being told do what you're told. You don't think anymore. You can't bring yourself to the room when it comes to that delivering of a service or experience. And I feel like there used to be this satire of the computer says no. It's like people don't get agency to think anymore and deliver service. It's like, I'm sorry, the rules stop me from thinking or doing what's right or compassionate. I have a lot of empathy for that, but it doesn't translate into good customer service. And we all know if the
yeah.
customer experience is bad, then the profits are going to go down. So yeah, there's
Yep.
a real issue, a real human issue here, but also it translates into dollars as well in terms of negative dollars. Now you'd mentioned that 70% statistic from McKinsey about 70% of change initiatives fail. Um, Before we get to what we can do right, because I know you've got some great ideas there, why do so many traditional top-down efforts struggle to make an impact? And what's the core of the problem here?
I think when you look at that, the biggest mistakes that organizations make really is a lack of emotional engagement,
Mm,
right? Um, and also it's really hard to have metrics on change, right? So the idea of like a lot of people, a lot of organizations, and this is actually something we think about with either org. I talked about that or earlier about creating inspiring alternatives for organizational design and development. And in 2020, we came together as a community and have been doing deeper and deeper work into being like, what is happening in the workplace today? And a lot of the frameworks that have been given to us by McKinsey, I'm thinking like Cotter's framework or like even the pro side, the change management frameworks that are there. If you look at the underlying beliefs behind it, it is created by white men.
mhm.
And it is created by people of privilege, right? And so what we have been thinking about in like either org, for example, is like, what would a change effort look like if a woman created it, right? Or a person of color, right? Or maybe both, right? Like, and we're doing it in the collective, with the group that we're with. So when you design something that they say it's kind of that performative piece, or people say that like, oh, we do care about people in the process, but it's like, well, that is not proving that it's actually taking this human process, right? And change and transformation is emergent. And that is kind of that might be a jargony term, but essentially just think about it is that when when you do change, it's unpredictable, right? Let me liken this to this quick story. I used to do construction for a living, do a lot of Habitat for Humanity as well. And we would renovate houses in downtown Baltimore City. And when you renovate a house, you do not know what is happening.
Right.
You will open a door up, I mean a wall up, and there is like a ton of things that you did not even anticipate, right? So you need to think on your toes, right? And so similarly, if you're reimagining or rethinking an organization, there is going to be things that when you open those walls up, there's going to be cobwebs in there. There's going to be like things that you need to fix that you did not predict when you started, right? And that is kind of happening in our organizations and when we're reimagining organizations, but also when we think about our personal lives, right? About the things that we've learned, our society has taught us, but also there's a lot of things we need to unlearn from that. So I went on a big speech there.
No, I love
Yes.
that. I love the analogy of the it's funny, I used to volunteer for Habitat for Humanity as well. It's a great organization, but I love the analogy of the opening up of the wall. And what that makes me think as you're describing that is when the going gets tough, sometimes we return swiftly to our defaults. So even if we start with good intentions of co-creating and a new order, a new paradigm, it's very easy to shift back into defaults when things start to get difficult. And like you said, what you find in the wall is the metaphor for that. It reminds me of I mentioned command and control, but it reminds me of Stephen Covey's book, Trust and Inspire, where he
Mhm.
supposes command and control with trust and inspire as a culture framework. He says we often fall into enlightened command and control. It's like it's our default. You also, I think, mentioned the juxtaposition of new power versus old power in your writing. So
Yeah.
can you
Yeah.
explain those concepts and why shifting from old power to new power is so difficult for many organizations?
Yeah. So this comes from a book in 2018. So as part of my story, I go into the Obama administration. We do all this research in the Trump administration, and we believe in open, participatory, and peer-driven work, right? And that is literally what the first executive order that Obama wrote was that, right? Say, we're going to create the most open, transparent, and participatory government that ever existed, right? So when you juxtapose that, when you're in a new paradigm, right? That was a paradigm that we were living in the Obama administration. And in the first Trump administration, it was a very different ballgame, right? So I'm essentially representing by the time I left the White House, we had 5,000 people in the movement, the Better Government movement, that is. And so, the idea between movement and mandate, right? That is underlying that entire mentality around movement versus mandate is this concept of old power versus new power. And let me explain to you. So, um, as I go deeper, about 18 months into that administration, it's very clear that the things that I value, right, of the open, participatory, peer-driven work, power is a current, right? Now, you've mentioned agency before. Power and agency are really connected, right? So if you have command and control, power is hoarded at the top, right? It's top down, it's hierarchical, it's compliance driven, right? To bring in the idea of compliance. That is actually a system that is embedded into the federal government. The federal government is like the hierarchy of the military, for example, right? There is like the person at the top and then everything trickles down. Obviously, there's some current challenges with that process right now. So control is centralized. Employees are expected to follow the rules without questioning them, right? You see that happening with Doge right now, right? And then culture change is dictated by policies, directives, one size fits all solutions, right? So this new policy is done and it's being done to you, not with you, right? New power is now a decentralized, it's participatory, co-create with each other. And employees are active participants in shaping that culture. Culture is driven through grassroots involvement and shared leadership. And when organizations where employees design the compliance solutions rather than following external models. And so that's kind of a story of what's happening. The end of this story, which I write about in my book, I have a whole chapter, by the way, on power, right, in my book, because power and agency is so important here. This is something I share about in my book. But this idea of when I went into the room, right, let me just tell you, right before I left the White House and everything was taken down in innovation.gov and the Better Government movement, I went into a meeting with senior Trump officials, and they literally said, "You're thinking of everything wrong. You need to fit into what we're doing," even though they didn't have a vision. And then what they said at the end of the meeting is, it was like, "You work for me and you work for this president," right? That is telltale signs of that. But at the time, actually, it wasn't until after I leave and a few months later when I'm doing talking to folks at the NIH on giving a keynote address, when a senior leader at NIH tells me about this book, and it blew my mind, because at the same time the book is being written, these words are being said to me. And so let me just say one more quick thing about this old power, new power. So the shift is monumental, right? It's an aha moment that a lot of people I don't think are getting, but it's really hard to do the shift. And that's why we're called the Culture Shift Studio, right? There's fear of losing control, right? Leaders are hesitant to share decision-making authority. Number two, short-term thinking. Old power relies on quick fixes and KPIs, key performance indicators for folks who don't know what KPIs are. And then new power is about long-term trust building. It's going to work in the long term, but in the short term, it might not, right? It's going to take a little bit of time to get on the same page, right? And then the third one is that change is uncomfortable, right? It has been labeled as this idea of leaders, employees resist this. There's also resistance to change that happens. A lot of times it might require us to be vulnerable, to adapt. And I find that, and studies have said this too, is that it is something that we're not conditioned to do. And so it's creating new grooves in our brains on this is the way we need to work. And like you said, you're like, we tend to go to the things that we already know. Right. So creating a new groove is immensely hard for many people.
There it is, the title for the podcast episode, The Compliance Officer's New Groove. I love that. And you're so right, because again, as you were talking, I was thinking, this all makes so much sense. I think intuitively, none of us will argue that trust is the way to go. Agency is the way to go. Leveraging the talents of the people we're paying for and hiring, that's the way to go. But there's an immense fear of trusting people to do the things, right? So we hoard that power. at the top and we're very scared. I do think that might be the key pushback. And so you're right, this paradigm shift takes some work. And I'm so glad we've got people like you, Amy, that can guide companies through this because that's exactly what we need. One of my favorite quotes is courage is not the absence of fear, but it's knowing something else is more important than your fear. And I think this it really works beautifully here because we do need courage. Compliance officers, C-suites board to try this trust and inspire, you know, empathy and action approach. And we have to let go of some of those survival brain fears that say, oh, the masses need controlling. Yeah, I love that. Now you've mentioned some of your experiences in politics, and of course the overriding factor is there is administration change. It's very hard to have sustainable change when you've got people coming in trying to put their stamp on. So just putting politics aside for a second, how do we create sustainable change in organizations or lasting change? Why aren't mandates alone enough to drive sustainable culture change in a corporation or a community?
Hmm. Well, so I think one of the challenges of this work is that challenges and also wonderful things about this work is that it's contextual, right? One of the principles that we had on innovation.gov was it's not a one size fits all approach,
Mhm.
right? And so what we mean by that is that you go into an organization, there is so many different factors you need to go into. There's a lot of sensing involved. There's also another concept in innovation called the innovation adoption curve, which is kind of like a bell curve, right? And so when we think about this idea, right, there's the innovators, early adopters, right? So those are the people are like 15 first, the top 15% of your population is going to help you unlock the rest of the population, right? So you need to engage the change makers, the innovators of your organization. They're going to help you build the context within the organization to unlock the rest of the people, right? If you talk about the bell curve, there's the early majority, the late majority that happens, right? And then the last one are the laggards or the ones at the end of the curve, right? You're not focused on the laggards, right? You have to focus on that adoption curve
Mhm.
because once the early majority and late majority happen, the laggards will have to follow along, right? There's also a book called Crossing the Chasm. And the chasm is in between the early adopters and early majority. And often, right? And there's so many analogies I can bring in here, but like often the chasm exists between those two is like, how do you actually take those people who are early adopters and cross the chasm into getting the whole, the people, the early majority to actually start making the changes, right? And so that's underlying this whole framework. There's also this concept that I talk about, and I'm going to write an article about this soon. It's called orbiting the giant hairball. Have you heard of that phrase?
No.
It's actually pretty tongue in cheek, and I can't remember the author who wrote this book. The concept is essentially that a system, right, and hierarchical system is the giant hairball of like policies and procedures and compliance and all these different things. It is a mess, right? But what innovation does, what we do in our work is creating it. We're orbiting, a satellite orbiting this hairball, right? So in many ways, this orbiting is creating different systems, different mentalities, different what the future must be. And for example, I worked a good bit with Jobs for the Future. There's a Jobs for the Future Labs or JFF Labs, the Innovation Lab. What they do is in the lab, they spin off new parts of the business of the company. And then JSF proper, that's been around for a long time, once they get it to a stable place, they then go and embed that into JFF, right? Proper. And that is often where the change gets broken, is that satellite doesn't always get built in and untangles that kind of like hairball that's in the inside. So over and over again, like, that I'm just giving you some visuals here of like the early adopters, innovators over here, but also that giant hairball. In order to untangle it, you need to understand there's a better way forward, right? And this is co-created. This is a space where new power is created. New power is out here, old power is in here, right? So that's the idea behind like mandate versus movement, right? So this is the movement out here, this satellite, but it's the in here, the mandate. So I think both of those things in some ways, if you're in a hierarchical organization like the federal government, I also worked in a management consulting firm, you need both of those things, right? I'm not saying it's either or, right? It's both of those things sometimes. So you need leadership to be on board with what you're doing, of course, if you're in a very hierarchical organization, but you also need a movement. And I think that movement piece is the thing that's missing most of the time.
I'm going to have so much fun with your metaphors. I've got this idea of my favorite cat coughing up the hairball. Like, move that
That's kind
hairball.
of the image that you're going.
Maybe a title for a future episode, Orbiting the Giant Hairball. I love it. I love it. It's so good. There was something else you'd said a bit earlier that I don't want to forget to come back to in it.
Yeah.
You mentioned making emotional connections when you're doing this work. I want to just underscore that because I think that's so important. It really provoked in me again this kind of why don't we draw from customer service for employee experience? Why don't we draw from marketing when it comes to marketing the movement, right? Like this idea of making a connection with your audience to move them. So I wanted to ask you a bit about that. I know that in your research you identify 4 pillars. Emotional connection is one of those. So please tell us about the pillars and tell us about how important they are.
hmm Yeah. So like of effective movements, I think I probably embedded that into one of my many articles that I've been putting out. And recently I've been like, you know what? I'm about to launch some big research with either org. And so leading up to that, I've been publishing articles to be like, let's get into the mind of what I've been building and doing for a really long time. These are my inspirations. And so let me just go through these 4 pillars here. Is number 1, the emotional connection. People change when they feel something, right? And this is actually coming from the world of addiction recovery, right? And also that has been ported over to culture change as well. People will change if they have an emotional connection to the work, right? And so movements create that change by tapping into our personal values, our identity, and our lived experience, right? That's the way to get into the heart, the vulnerability, right? The things that emotional intelligence does. But employees don't just need to know what needs to change, they need to understand why it matters to them personally, right? It's not just being like, we're doing this. They call this thing in change management, we call this thing the burning platform, right? But it's a little misguided because the burning platform is like, we're all on this platform that's burning and we're falling down, right? Can you imagine? What does that make you feel? How does that make you feel? That makes you feel like fear and anxious, anxiety. And it's like, no, that is not the right metaphor here. Please don't use that metaphor in this work. It is like, okay, in this work that I'm going to be launching soon, and the article I just published since we even talked about this is about the public narrative framework. What is the story of self? What is my story and the story of us, right? So how does my story of self blend into the story of us, the organization? And then you also juxtapose that against the story of now, right? What is the story of now? And what are the trends that are showing up in the organization? So we could just be like, okay, let's get curious about that. Anyway, so that's the emotional connection there, like connecting our story of self with the story of us. So I could go into all the 4 pillars. Would you like me to do that?
Sure, let's do a quick whistle stop tour of them because they're
Okay.
important. It's genius. It's so
Okay.
it's so practical, Amy. I really feel like we can apply this in our daily work. So please share it with us.
Love it. Love it. Okay. 2, grassroots energy. So change spreads bottom up, not just top down.
Mhm.
So real change happens when employees are owning the movement and not just executives, right? Some of the work that I've been doing, some research I've been doing with Georgetown University actually is around this path of us using game design to do systems change, right? So that's a whole nother ball of wax we could go deeper into. But often in that research, we find that executives, C-suite doesn't know what's happening on the ground most of the time, right? And so we're working on ideas on like, can we create a game that simulates the environment that's on the ground that executives could play, for example, right? So they could have more empathy, right? Connect emotionally to that, like this system that is probably broken. There's some things that are broken on that, and we can improve that much faster. So organizations need to empower employees as active participants and not just passive recipients of the new rules. An example of that is Netflix's culture of freedom and responsibility you may have come across in your work. instead of enforcing these HR policies, they created an employee-driven culture of accountability. And that's certainly, I think, a more modern way of thinking about this. So that was grassroots energy. Three is influence over enforcement.
Mm,
Um, Social norms drive behavior more than the rules, right? Mandates rely on enforcement, right? Movements rely on peer influence and cultural reinforcement, right? That's the juxtaposition there. People are more likely to change their behavior when they see colleagues modeling the behavior, right? This is what we say also in emotional intelligence. The whole concept of burnout happens because we do not have emotional intelligence. We're not modeled emotional intelligence growing up. And in our workplaces, we're not modeled emotional intelligence. So how are we supposed to be emotionally intelligent humans, if that's not modeled? So that is like that aha moment that we've been doing in our research too. And so people are more likely to change their behavior when they see that modeling happening. Emotional intelligence, psychological safety. If you are in a place where you feel utterly safe and trust that person, that is transformational, right? And then the last one here is authenticity. Real change can't be performed, it must be lived,
mm,
right? So in an increasingly challenging world, we crave authenticity. We crave storytelling, right? We crave this model the behaviors that people want to see, but I'm authentically myself and I'm not just trying to be a puppet for that somebody else is telling me to do, right? And in an organizational perspective, and one example is like B Corp corporations, right? Patagonia, Ben and Jerry's, think about that. They don't claim to care about sustainability or ethical business practices. They actually embed them into their daily operations and say, we're taking a principled, values-based stand. And that's also imbued in the work that we do with either org and the research is like, how do we go back to values and what are our shared values going back to the story of self and the story of us? What are these shared values and how do we make them real in our workplace? Right. So, yeah.
uh, masterclass, Amy. This is so good. And I do think this is a roadmap for my listeners that are in compliance. We really can. th- I mean, these are not rocket science ideas, but the operationalization of them is what we need help with sometimes, right? Again, back to courage. It takes courage and it takes leadership to do that. You quite rightly noted, I mean, we can't throw the rule books out. We might want to untangle this furball that they are, the behemoth they've become. But how do we blend the idea then of movement and mandates? I think that would be a really good first step from compliance officers to find a way to blend effectively. I know you talk about a yes and approach. You said that already in terms of it's not one or the other. But what does that look like in practice? What have you seen out there where people are doing this effectively?
Yeah, yeah. So one thing I would say is the idea is like obviously executives need to go through this transformation themselves to realize ego, let's put ego aside. And that's hard for a lot of people because our society gives power to people who are powerful, right?
Mhm.
And so that hierarchy. So I think in a lot of ways, we have to build awareness, right? There's this phrase also coming from the world of addiction recovery is awareness, acceptance. We just talked about awareness, aware of these are the things that I might need to unlearn about my existence. Number two is acceptance, right? So I'm accepting where I am on my journey and where I might need to go, right? And then you get to that place, and then that's when you take action. Okay. So that's kind of a spiritual journey that a lot of executives or leaders need to go on. But then if it's more tangible things, right, that can take months and years to make that determination and that change. But more tangible things is like involving employees early, right? So, one quick thing is being like, okay, how do I go from myself, individualism to collectivism, the collective? So instead of me saying, what do I think about this? We say, what do we think about this? Right. So it's like from me to we, right? So giving people voices to shape the change that will change things immensely. Number two, focus on storytelling and connection. It's really when you relate to real human experiences and those storytelling aspect, that will also move mountains for you. That's where emotional connection comes through storytelling.
Yeah.
Number three, empower champions at all levels, right? I talked about that curve, innovators, early adopters. Every organization has innovators and early adopters who are already unlocking the change for the rest of everybody else. But they might not, they might be the rock stars of the organizations, but they also could be the quiet ones who are under like doing grassroots change in your organization. So try to take those people, lift them up, become champions for those people, right? And then make change the norm, not the exception.
Yeah.
So I bring in kind of a lot of Buddhist ideas into my work. And one of the things is the idea of impermanence. And I'm sure you're, you're familiar with this, Emma, but other folks might not be. But the idea of impermanence is that nothing is permanent, is really what it comes down to, is that we are always shifting in our day, and the world around us is always shifting. So think about it as like two circles that are like moving at the same time, right? And that's the image that comes around when I think of impermanence, right? So we are not the same person today when we started the day to when we end the day. And so there's a couple great things about that is recognizing that change is inevitable, right? Is change is part of this. And once you realize that that's the path, right? That is the path of recognizing. I was just talking last week with my team about this idea of groundlessness that Pema Chodron talks about.
Right.
And this idea there is no ground underneath us, right? She
Right.
talks about if once you realize that we are always in free fall, that we're always changing and always shifting, that is the way of the warrior. That is the way of our work, right? So uncertainty is the norm, right? We are told that certainty is like craving certainty, craving control, right? Is the thing that we should want. But once you realize that we don't have control and there is no certainty, things change massively for us.
And I love that you ask us to focus on ourselves first and see our attitude to that. How do we exist in that space, right? Because once we start to be aware, as you said, understand how we sit in that space, only then can we begin to deign to influence others. But I like that. And yes, it might be a lot of work, but it's definitely work that's worthwhile because let's say you have done some of that work and you are enlightened.
Mhm,
And you've given us some practical steps already to bring others with you. I did hear you on that.
mhm.
But as a leader, then what can you do to work within these already existing structured and regulated environments to apply this enlightened? I'm going to use the word enlightened because just this enlightened approach to culture change for impact at scale.
Yeah. Um, wow, there's lots of things I can think. So there's a lot of things like to do taking this approach to culture change. Is that kind of like a good introduction from that? Okay. So shift from enforcement to empowerment, right? So I'm specifically talking about compliance professionals here, right? And if you've already gone through this change and you're like, oh, I'm here, right? Like I'm doing that. You have purpose, you have who you are as a person, then you have to start thinking about, okay, once I understand what my principles are, right? And I'm like, I'm thinking in my head this framework that I have in my book where it's bringing in this empathetic approach, right? The like book's been published for like 4 years now, but it's still super relevant. A lot of people say is that there's three different kinds of empathy, and that is the head, the heart, and the hand.
Uh-huh.
The head, so the head is called cognitive empathy. And so cognitive empathy is essentially what we think, and we are usually stuck in our brains, right? The components of cognitive empathy are two is like number one, how do I take somebody else's perspective and I stay out of judgment?
Mhm.
And that is where we often get stuck in the workplace, right? In leadership, in other ways. Then it's the heart. And you can see this as an individual, but also in an organization. The heart is affective empathy, emotional empathy, right? And then the hand is a hand out that I have on the front of my cover of my book, and that's action. What are we doing with the work? And so when you look at it from the perspective of looking at different aspects of organization, right? You're going from the individual, the story of self, to the story of us. We're shifting into that. When you get to the story of us, you have to start with the heart. You have to start with the emotions. So that's what is our purpose? What's our North Star? Who are the people that are here, right? That's the heart of this organization. And then you go into the head. You start saying, what are the principles and values that we collectively have amongst each other? And then you start saying, then that's where policies come in, like in the head. That's the compliance piece, right? There's things that we have to have compliance, but then also we can set our own policies that we can comply to. And then the third grouping in the circle here is the hand. And like, it's like, what do we do in our workplace? And that is, what are the practices that we're going to build into our lives, right? Again, with compliance, right? Like, how are we building compliance into our everyday life, right? So that it's a muscle that we're building into on top of all the other cultural things that we need to do. The last piece in that to complete the circle is process. Compliance sometimes is a process. So it's like that's the doing part that builds out the culture out there. So there you go. A little bit about like that.
I mean, I feel so lucky, so grateful to you first that you're doing the work and doing the thinking and then sharing it with us, not just through the podcast today, but through your books. I really recommend you get Amy's books. The books, there'll be more, but definitely get Empathy in Action. It's brilliant. I'll put a link to it with the resources. Because again, you're giving us practical frameworks that we can apply today, whether we're doing the work on ourselves or whether we're now trying to do the work for our cultures. I feel a bit greedy asking you for one more, but I know that you talk about the thriving together method.
All
And so
right.
I don't want to go without asking you to tell us a little bit about that and how that method that you've created helps organizations create lasting cultural change. Let's dive a little bit more into this because it's so good, Amy. Thank you
Oh,
for
geez. Like,
sharing.
I love it. Thank you, Hemma. So, no, not surprising. Over the past 20 years, I've been steeped in this, but I've just been like, things are a little off, right? And so, what I have done is like, I actually have a ton of different influences, like I was mentioning earlier in my work. And so, the thriving together method is kind of an amalgamation of a lot of different frameworks that is actually being used to actually take that, like that orbiting the giant hairball and making it so that you can actually not have that hard landing, failing, getting to the place of failure. It's actually building all these things that we're talking about, shifting from old power to new power, right? And so this thriving together method is allowing us to do the mental, sometimes gymnastics to get to where we need to go, but actually making it actionable. So we have it as three different phases. So phase one, we have a organizational audit that we do with organizations. So we can go into your organization and try to find out what are the key factors, like what's really going on in the organization. It's called illuminate. So we're illuminating like what's happening in the organization, building that awareness I was talking about before. Phase two is what we call incubate, right? We're bringing in this idea of from startup culture of incubating this essential lovable culture that I was talking about. And you were saying a lovable culture is, and we're bringing that idea from like the startup culture of like minimum viable product, right? We're trying to say, what is the values that we all want to have? What is the structure of the organization? How do we do our work, right? Looking at that framework I was talking about in that circle. How do we want to be, right, as an organization? And then you create experimentation, right? And so that's a process of lean startup. Essentially, you build something, you measure its effectiveness, and then you learn. And then you keep doing that process. Once you've created that lovable culture you want to have, you build upon it, right? And then once you have that culture, the third phase is accelerate, right? You've worked with the innovators, you've worked with the early adopters, you've engaged your people. Then you say, you're getting at this point to how do we take deeper action and how do we get to accountability, right? How do we embed accountability into the organization? And when I show this framework, and it's relatively new and I'm launching over the next 6 or 8 months, is when I show this to people, they're like, this is magic because
Yeah.
so often a McKinsey or BCG will come in and be like, oh, your baby's ugly in organizations, right? Or like, they were like, here's the data. But often those organization, other ones don't know how to change, how to actually change with emergence in it, right? And so this framework is magic because we can quickly get in, see the data, and then actually I help guide organizations and build capacity at the same time. So I get to work with your people to train them up to lead this platform and to lead this work over and over and over again so that you have that accountability that's built in over time.
No, Amy, if you'd started with that last sentence, I'd be like, yeah, sure, sure. I've heard it before. You think you can help me. But having heard you explain your thinking, your models, your methods, your research, your work, your experience, I know that to be true. You've sold me. I believe it. And
Thank
we
you.
all need an Amy. We all need someone to come in to help us thrive together. We all need someone to come and help us operationalize our best intentions because there's lots of smart people out there that want what you're describing. But somehow we've all struggled to achieve it, whether in a micro organization or at large. So I'm really
Mhm.
excited and I'm so grateful to you for taking the time to be so generous and share so many of your models. Look, what Amy's writing about and what she's studied and what she's created is out there for us to read and learn about. You can do it yourself with her guidance, but there's no better way than do it with her. I have to do it for you.
Yes, of
We all
course.
we all
Happy
need
to
some
talk.
help when it comes to this, and you've got the experience of many organizations. So oh, let me ask you a couple closing questions. Looking back on your career and the work you've done, that I'm just so impressed with. It's impacted me in the short time I've known you. What legacy do you, Amy Wilson, hope to leave in the field of workplace culture and compliance?
Um,
Uh,
so I feel like, and this is becoming, at the beginning of the call, I talked about the stats that are coming out, right? 77% of people are disengaged or miserable at work, and half of us are burnout, right? For about a year and a half, I've really focused on the emotional intelligence, psychological safety, and like culture of care work. And now I'm like pivoting to being like, okay, it's yes and right. Like, yes, that work around emotional intelligence, psychological safety, it's embedded in this work, right? It's like we were talking about earlier. It is personal work that leaders and people need to kind of to build and to do this work. But at the same time, at the end of the day, we have to change the system. We have to change the organization because we're going to keep perpetuating harm and more burnout. And so the system needs to shift. And many people that I have found do not know how to shift that. Right.
right.
And so if we can shift organizations from control that happens over here to co-creation,
Mhm.
that is the pathway, right, to help people. So that's something that I really think about. Um, and I think that empathy, emotional intelligence is a strategic advantage. There's research that says that when you have more communication, you have greater retention, you have greater, when we're living our best lives, we can help us live our best lives if we do that once we do this work. And I think from my perspective, for sure, and I think a personal question that came up in a panel discussion I was in last week, it was International Women's Day last week, and it was a whole panel about accelerating action in the workplace, right? And the thing that came true for me, and this is a story I'll just end with, because I know you might have a question or two with this, is everybody has a personal story of why they do what they do. Fortunately or unfortunately for me, I have a lot of stories of why I do what I do. I mentioned one earlier with the two administrations in the White House, but I had once had a leader who was a leader of innovation tell me when I came to her with a challenge I needed help with, she said to me, I would help, but I'm not your mother. And you can imagine, we're experiencing this. This was more than a decade ago when somebody said this. And looking back on it, I recognized a lot of different things, right? And if you want to, we can send the link to the panel discussion of that. I specifically tell this data with women in the workplace. Um, but one thing that I know, and the data is showing it, is that women specifically are under resourced. She was not well resourced. She was not empowered to support me. And that had a ripple effect, right? So I'm her subordinate. Talking to her. She tells me I'm not your mother. She's shaming me. because she's probably at capacity and can't take it on, right? She doesn't have resources to support me mentally or physically. And then also, like, I'm shamed, and I know I can't go to her. And now the whole team, like, I don't know what to do with the team because, like, I didn't have psychological safety. And then only a few months later, I have a breakdown because, and everybody else on our team was breaking down as well around me. That happened. And like, so it was just like this ripple effect that was happening because, like the top down, with the mandate that was happening. And I was in the process of taking 100-year-old company at the time and bringing it into the modern day world, right? And what does that look like? So that was a time, but that kind of gives me an experience where I'm like, I don't want other people to experience this, particularly other women, because what the data is also saying is that for every woman who's promoted, 2 women are leaving the workforce.
Right.
So think about that. Women are leaving the workforce in droves. And what can we point to? It's a lack of emotional intelligence and psychological safety that we feel in our workplaces. So something needs to change.
What a moving story. And just, of course, the empathy in action as you tell the story, you seeing the empathy of your boss and her positioning and why that happened, but also turning pain into positive action, I think is what I hear from that as well, because part of your legacy will be making sure that others don't have to go through that. And that's not just a kindness to other ladies in the workplace. It's not just what it is. It's like you said, it's the impact that we can all make if we thrive together. So really moved. Thank you for sharing that story. Amy. Thank you for coming today. The only question I've got to close is if our listeners want to find you and contact you, we'll share some resources, but how can they best connect with you and learn more about either org, my British accent coming in, and the Culture Shift Studio?
Yeah. So my personal website is amyjwilson.com. That's where you're going to get the latest information. You can follow me on LinkedIn as well. I'm sure this will be in the show notes. And I also have a newsletter. It's aptly called Empathy in Action right now. So that's what we're doing. And also, if you want to follow our research that's coming out with either org as the year progresses, we're going to be putting our research around that public narrative framework, the story of self, the story of now, etc., is going to be launched with either org. And that's at either org, O-R-G, right? Like play on words, right? Eitherorg.org. And you can also follow us and join our community on LinkedIn. So.
Brilliant. Well, a veritable treasure chest of resources and insights and genius. Amy, thank you again. We'll have to have you back, and welcome to the compliance community because we need you.
Thank you. I'm here for whatever comes my way with compliance. So thank you for listening, folks. I hope you get to make some changes.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day. One actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet, every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network. And don't miss the Sunday Book Review, where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network. Available wherever you listen to podcasts.